Next, I would like to invite Mr. Sajan Khosla to deliver the industry keynote on role of AI and ML in capitalizing the real-world evidence for better healthcare outcomes. Mr. Sajan is from an organization whose name we have heard right from the beginning of this pandemic. He comes from AstraZeneca. And welcome, Mr. Sajan. And just to give his little background, Mr. Sajan is the head of real-world evidence oncology R&D in AstraZeneca, supporting the organization in use of application of insight from real-world data from early drug discovery to regulatory submission. He has deep background in quantitative science, starting from molecular biology, background applying statistical techniques to identify signals in high-dimensional genomic data to more recently, where he has been applying Bayesian inference models to large electronic medical record data. Mr. Sajan has responsibility for the oncology R&D real-world evidence capability and leads the team of highly tuned data scientists that leverage these data for wider AstraZeneca consumption. Mr. Sajan, may I have a pleasure of inviting you to deliver the industry keynote. Welcome, and all the way from UK.
Thank you ever so much. And I will just share my screen so that everyone can see the presentation. Could I just get a visual check to make sure people can see my screen?
Yep. Yes, we can.
Fantastic. Thank you ever so much for the kind words and the introduction. And it's a great pleasure to be here to be able to virtually present to this audience. I've been listening in to the discussion so far, and it's actually fascinating to see how the response to the pandemic is emerging internationally as well. What I will be talking to you about today is really how within AstraZeneca we have applied artificial intelligence, machine learning to support the utilization of data that emerges from different health systems and how we support learning health systems by utilizing these methodologies. A bit of a pre-disclaimer is really that these are really the opinions expressed by myself and not necessarily tied to my organization from whom I represent, AstraZeneca. So please make sure that, if there are any questions, please reach out if you do have any questions regarding the material. I'll just go through a bit of a background as to what I'll be talking to you about today, is just introducing the theme around real world evidence and data and big data and analytics. Also how we utilize real world data and analytics in the health system, and how we utilize AI and innovate by utilizing AI. And to really make this come true, I thought it would be good to represent some case studies as well, just so some real life examples of like kind of the way that these methodologies and technologies can be utilized to support like kind of the analysis of those data so that we can really impact the way that we are getting medicines to patients faster. So this slide comes to no surprise to individuals, and especially with such an esteemed audience like this. But I think it's really important to highlight the ever-growing connectivity of the data that is being generated, but then also how the data can be reutilized. So we're working towards this fifth generation of technology where, data is ubiquitously available. The types of things that are connecting data are becoming more complicated. There are some parts of the world where there are microchips on the door handles that are understanding every time a door is being opened, for instance. That data is starting to be acquired and generated. And the types of data that we have access to are so varied and so complex. And we don't even know whether we're going to use those data all the time either. So data is being generated in a fashion where its reuse is really going to be important. And we generate more data now than we have done in the history of time as well. So making sure that we can leverage these data is really going to be really increasingly important. And as systems and different markets start to get their maturity in the 5th generation technology, it's really how do we utilize that data going forward. So what we have is this complex situation where we've got high volumes of data, high variety of data, and high velocity of data. And this is a combination that we call or term big data. And what we generally try to do is we try to use all the data, make sure it's accessible all the time, make sure it's accessible to all users, and is accessible by all desired platforms. So this box that I've put around here is a bit of a misnomer, because what we try to do is unbox the data as much as possible. So we don't necessarily want to restrain people from accessing data or making sure the data is in a situation where it cannot be used unless it has to be, in that sense. So what we think about big data is really this maturity curve. So and it's a maturity curve that we often find within data analytics. So you start off with, a very descriptive view. So tell me what has happened with the data. And this is really where we spend a lot of our time in the world now. Dashboards being generated to make sure that we can understand what has happened in the past. Then you move on to the diagnostics and this type of interpretations that you can to apply from that data. So really starting to understand, here's an outcome. Why did that outcome happen? Or how do we start to utilize the data to understand why events happen? To where we are right now in the predictive and prescriptive space, where it's really the utilization of these algorithms and these mechanisms to then support decision making by using predictive capabilities or even prescriptive capabilities. So the predictive will help us, at a population health level to understand, here's a trajectory, this is what we need to think about, these are the factors that we need to think about. The prescriptive is really, that clinical decision support type of environment where a physician or a medic can utilize all that history of data to really help them and aid them and guide them when it comes to, the way that they treat patients in the real world. So what we think about is really this descriptive to prescriptive journey and how we utilize data and real world data in this instance to support that. And not everything has to be prescriptive. There's great benefit in being prescriptive, but we need to understand where the value is before we get to that level of maturity. Now, I use the term real world evidence quite often, and I often forget that there's people within different areas of the world that aren't necessarily attuned to what real world evidence is. So what I try to do as much as possible is really start to explain and define real world evidence. And what we call real world evidence, and this is a definition from the FDA's guidance, is really to define real world evidence, you need to unpack that term into real world data and real world evidence. So to define real world evidence, you need to define real world data. And real world data is really data that relates back to patients' health status and is supported by the routine collection of data from a variety of different sources. These could be electronic health records, they could be data from observational studies, they could be patient-generated data like on apps, or they could even be tracking data, as we heard around, instances like vaccination tracking and understanding who's getting a vaccine and who's not getting a vaccine. And the evidence is really that synthesis of the data into the clinical evidence. So this is a very robust, methodologically and scientifically rigor approach that we apply to the data. And these are often observed in high-end scientific journals where we might be running observational studies, might be running pragmatic clinical trials, or even registry studies. So these real-world evidence is really that clinical evidence that you generate from the real-world data. And there are lots of steps between the real-world data and ultimately evidence, such as insights and also analytics that fill the gap between that continuum of real-world data to the synthesis of real-world evidence. So just to give you an example, actually, so the types of data that real-world evidence often utilizes, and a really good way to describe this is to take a patient's timeline. So this is a patient and their longitudinal electronic medical records. And in this electronic medical record, we can start to understand the comorbidities and the conditions of a patient, previous to them being diagnosed with a particular condition, or then after they are diagnosed with a particular condition. And we can start to look at inpatient procedures, we can start to look at outpatient diagnostics, we can look at all the laboratory observations and the medications that they're taking. And also, in some instances, we can go into clinical notes to understand and extract certain elements from their clinical notes. Now, that's quite a simplistic view, but what happens is it's very complicated. Is because lots of events occur, lots of observations are occurring, and there's this longitudinality of the data. So to really derive causal links between an event and an outcome is actually quite tricky to do with these longitudinal records. And ultimately, we want to look at outcomes, and this is where we want to be able to anchor our prescriptive, our descriptive analyses to really support the way that we can make sure that we can improve outcomes in patients. So real-world evidence and these kinds of data are really supporting a lot of pipeline decisions within the industry at present moments. And this is just an overview of the types of ways that we utilize real-world evidence within the industry, right the way from preclinical phase of like understanding disease epidemiology through to like kind of phase 4 and commercialization, where we can understand whether a product is cost effective, how do we measure the value of the product, and what is the overall outcome for the patient. So what we will probably see quite a lot of in the coming future is really this explosion of vaccine and outcomes data within that phase 4 space, and really utilizing and leaning on electronic medical records and these routinely collected health data to understand almost like those safety observations that can reinforce the way that we collect safety data in a mandatory manner. And these are really quite important features and how to utilize real-world data in this space. So I want to then move on to a bit about AI and innovation within the pharma industry, because one of the things that we have done quite a lot of within the industry is utilize AI to expedite processes. So right the way from like drug discovery and lab automation, we try to utilize these AI technologies to really support those decision-making processes and accelerate those decision-making processes. And that really means that we focus on the objectives, and then we also make sure we've got this feedback loop by which we can assess whether we're getting good outcomes versus bad outcomes, and then keep on readdressing and keep on relearning from these pieces. And one of the areas that we do this a lot of is like kind of driving operational efficiency. So one of the things you can see a lot of within the industry is really making sure that we are honing in on operational efficiency by using as much data as possible to give us that prescriptive and predictive insight that we need. A real good example is when we took this approach to a disease setting, and this is utilizing some US data where we utilized electronic medical records and registry data to really think about how we approach diabetes care. And one of the things that emerged from this was really this interlinked connection between cardio, renal, and metabolic conditions, and how the cardiovascular system, renal, and metabolic disease holistically need to be thought about. So we deployed an AI machine learning approach to scour these electronic medical records and really pull back to us like kind of all the extra comorbidities that may be influencing particular outcomes within disease settings. And what emerged was this real consistent message around CareMe, cardio, renal, and metabolic, highlighting that 6.4% of the patients within the US data set that had type 2 diabetes had no additional cardio, renal, and metabolic conditions. So that means over 90% of those did. 83% of those patients with type 2 diabetes had or were going to experience hypertension. And over 51% of those patients had more than 3 additional care me conditions. And this list of care me conditions is actually quite an exhaustive list, but it really helps the way that we think about patients. It really helps the way that we can support healthcare systems in looking after the patients. And back to my longitudinal records, these conditions are happening at various different time points as well. So what we have is a really intricate understanding as to what happens when and how to potentially intervene and help health systems intervene within those settings. The second example is one that I personally quite like, and it's mainly I like this because of the smart device that it's aligned to. So AstraZeneca have a smart device that is connected to their inhaler, their turbo inhaler, and it's called the Turbo Plus. And this Turbo Plus was designed to effectively understand how patients were taking their inhaler and when they were taking their inhaler, and then support them in their journey of medication adherence. What we saw was when patients were on this Turbo Plus inhaler, we observed that adherence rates were at 71%. Now, just to put that into context, a 71% adherence rate is similar to an adherence rate that you would see within a clinical trial, with lots of physicians looking after single patients and making sure patients are taking their drug. What we generally see is that patients are adherent at roughly about 30 to 40% of the time when they just take their normal inhaler. What we were able to show here is that the technology and the application of a smart device would really lead to greater adherence, but then also suggestions that there might be a more patient-centric view that we might be thinking about for patients, such as, taking into account the patient's weekend habits and giving them prompts to take their inhalers on the weekend versus during the week where there's a more regular approach. The third case study, and it's my penultimate case study, is really the way that we utilize data to inform clinical study designs and how do we recruit patients into clinical trials. So what we have the ability to do is really be able to leverage these massive sets of data to identify patient referral networks and different flows of patients in different tumor settings in oncology, but then also potentially for other disease settings as well. And then how do we utilize these federated electronic health records to enroll patients into clinical studies? Now, this is something that has been adapted quite a lot over the past few years, and we see quite a lot of utilization of this in Western Europe and the US. But one of the things that you can think about is if you've got a very good electronic health record system in place, these networks are actually going to really accelerate the way that you run clinical trials and then also execute on clinical trials. And the last one is really this visual analytical approach around treatment and disease pathways. And what we have the ability to do within AstraZeneca is in real time, put these skins on top of real world data. And this comes back to that diagnostic and descriptive view, where we can start to understand how different treatment modalities are being pursued within different markets, but then also, what are the longitudinal records showing us? So are patients likely to first have their CKD diagnosis and then move on to a hypertension condition, then diabetes? Or are these patients being treated in a different modality? And if so, do they have worse outcomes? So these are really key things that then we engage with different health systems on to really support those health systems understand their patients, but it also enables us to understand how we can better serve patients as well. So in summary, there are a variety of different aspects around big data, analytics, and AI. The aim is really to drive high quality patient-centered data and understand how we utilize that data. Ultimately, applying analytics to deliver like kind of implementable solutions. And I think implementable is really important. So you can't just take the same approach to different health systems. It has to be designed around the health system and the way that health system works. But then lastly, you need to make sure that you've got the right desired IT infrastructure to connect and access all these data, because blocking data into different silos is definitely a way against doing everything that I've showed you. So with that in mind, I will pause here and I'm open to any questions when the questions session starts.
Thank you, Dr. Sajan. Very insightful. I think 20 minutes do not do justice to the kind of work you're doing, actually. And I never imagined the amount of technology or data analytics that you're using as a part of pharma company to understand the patient behavior and the outcomes and apply that to your as a practice in pharma industry. So what I like to do is, I definitely know it now that we like to invite you for a bigger session to understand some of these things with a wider audiences, not just talking about vaccination, but where we're talking about much wider things, because your work spans quite a bit, into different areas, and very, very important. And I'll use that as a learning for us and many more, people who are connected to us. So I really appreciate and thank you for dialing in from UK, and what an eye-opener it was, and the great work AstraZeneca is doing on the vaccine anyway. And we have close connections between India and AstraZeneca on that, and we work closely with your organization as NASCOM. So thank you once again. With that, I would like to thank all the keynote speakers for their valuable insights. And I would like to now hand it over to Raghu to take it up from here on for the rest of the program. And we have very interesting set of speakers lined up in the next part of the session. So hold on and stay tuned for some really interesting observations and insights and the speakers and the great people we'll meet. So over to you, Raghu.